All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I feel like we always have to say that. My name is Todd Tucker. I'm the managing director for the FAIR Institute, and very excited about today's topic, and more importantly, today's panelists for this conversation. Welcome to the third-party risk management topic. We're going to talk about quantifying business risk to improve prioritization and treatment. Should probably say third-party risk prioritization and treatment in that title. I'll just really quickly kind of introduce myself as the managing director. I've been with the FAIR Institute for about a year now. For those of you that I've not had the opportunity to meet, I would love to have that chance someday. We're really leaning in with the FAIR Institute into third-party risk management as one of our core topics. It's something that we've, touched on over the years, but certainly doing more on this topic. We have a partnership with Third Party Risk Association. If you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend you check it out. We really, get a lot of value from that partnership. Helps us understand and reach third-party risk professionals better. Their founder, Julie, introduced us to Greg Rasner and Vincent Scales, who are on the call today. So I'm going to just, hand it over to Vincent and Greg to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into topics. Vincent, do you mind starting?
Yeah, absolutely. Todd, thanks so much for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of the folks who have taken time out of their day to attend this webinar. I'm Vincent Scales. I'm a lead director in the third-party security practice at CVS Health. And for those of you who are not aware, CVS Health is like the second largest healthcare corporation, conglomerate in America. And we have a prescription benefit manager underneath the umbrella, as well as an insurance provider. So we are a truly integrated healthcare provider, and we have all of the attendant challenges that come with managing the very sensitive health information of all of our customers. So it's an interesting job, and I love to think about managing third-party risk. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Greg has to say on the topic as well.
Greg, over to you.
Yeah, hey, this is Gregory Rasner. I am currently the CEO of Third Party Threat Hunting, a private consulting company that I run. I am the author of two books in third-party risk space. First one is Cybersecurity and Third-Party Risk, which is a book that I created after working for a couple of years leading a program at BB&T, which is now Truist, and looking around and not seeing a lot of literature on it, wrote that book, and then followed up about a year later with a book on zero trust and third-party risk, in case you want to really supercharge your program. I have another book coming out here in a little bit on privileged access management and how to make it a part of your zero trust program. And I'm also looking forward to hearing what Todd and Vincent, we've talked a little bit before this, obviously, to queue up the webinar, but well, I think we had to cut the queue up short because we could talk forever. So I'm looking forward to what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's jump in, and I'll just kind of provide a little bit of context. As I mentioned, the FAIR Institute's leaning into third-party risk, but in a lot of ways, it's not new to the FAIR Institute, to the discipline of FAIR-based, cyber risk quantification and management. We find that a large percentage of risk scenarios that people tackle with FAIR involve third parties. Naturally, as you've embraced the cloud, you've embraced services that are at least in part delivered by third parties or dependent on third parties. It's a big topic. However, we find that there's an opportunity to bridge between what we refer to as just cyber risk management and third-party risk management to improve outcomes. And so we're going to talk a lot about that today, like how do we bridge the two? Where can FAIR play a role, or just cyber risk quantification play a role in third-party risk management, and frankly, vice versa. So let's set the scene. Let's talk about the challenges in third-party risk management that you both see today. So, Greg, maybe let's just start with you. Like, what do you see as the key challenges today with third-party risk management?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges that everybody sees is a challenge of workforce, right? We're being asked to do less with more with less, which is really less. You kind of have to figure out how to do the same with less is really what you end up doing. And then the challenge, of course, of AI and what to do with that, both the opportunities it offers as well as some of the challenges, because we are now taking in a lot of AI products, right? So there's those two are the big challenges I see, and actually some of those play off each other, which I think we'll get into a little bit. But those are the big areas where I think folks are really challenged. Besides just the normal pace and cadence of breaches and incidents and events with our third parties. I think you talked about the fact that we're focused on third parties, and I think it's because as organizations we've spent lots of money securing our first party, and we've discovered that our third parties, our vendors, which we rely on because we don't want to be doing everything under the sun as organizations, haven't been doing some of the things that we expected them to do.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Vincent, like, one of the challenges I always hear about is just having visibility into third-party controls, and so that challenge pops up a lot. Is that something you see, or would you add anything additional to what Greg shared?
No, Todd, absolutely. And as usual, Greg has kind of really encapsulated the entire problem. There's so much more to do with either the same resources or generally less resources. And to the point about third-party controls, Todd, we're now really seeing the awareness of third-party risk management start to skyrocket in a lot of different people's minds. And that rising awareness is really driving so much pressure on your typical third-party risk management program. And I'll give you an example. We are now entering an age where C-level executives of companies are being held personally liable for cyber failings, for other material control failures within their companies. And that's now driving TPRM programs to be even better, to have even better visibility, to be scanning even more frequently for threats on the horizon. And third-party controls, as are kind of in the name, are outside of our control environment. They're outside of our sphere of awareness. And so now we're seeing products like Vanta and Drata, which are these kind of inside-out control monitoring tools. We're seeing more regular and more kind of invasive, if you will, assessments. And I think that all of this is coming together on third parties to drive fatigue, which is making the entire process that much more difficult. Because if you want to rewind 5 to 7 years, many very large companies either didn't have TPRM programs or they were pretty immature. And as a result, their capabilities were fairly limited. What they were asking third parties to do was also, accordingly, fairly limited. But now, and if you ask, a typical third party, they're just getting smashed with security questionnaires over and over and over again. And the problem with that is that fatigue makes every TPRM practitioner's job tougher by default. And so that's really, I kind of think, one of the major kind of problems that we have right now. Third parties are just kind of getting fed up with jumping through the TPRM hoops that we put them through.
Yeah. So it's happening on both sides. It's not just the first party that's assessing the third parties. It's also the third parties and all the companies that they're working with that are asking for the same thing. Let's switch for a second and talk about the threats to businesses that are third party related. Like it's evident that a lot of the breaches that we read about, or unfortunately some of us may experience, are related to third parties, either through a cloud provider or another type of service provider, or just breaches of data that is held by a business partner. How, like Greg, how do you see those threats evolving? Like, you talked about AI, but are there other things that kind of are evolving on the threat side as opposed to the, kind of the business side?
I wouldn't say evolving so much, Todd, as just the constant. So the geopolitical turmoil certainly is adding to this churn that we're seeing, right? That's adding to it, the threat level as well, right? And then the thing that really changed was SolarWinds, right? That's sort of the seminal moment, right? I coincidentally was starting to write the first book right at that period, and right when SolarWinds broke, I sat down and wrote the book like in a month and a half because I realized that was the time when people were going to say, "Wait a second, I got to pay attention to this third-party stuff." Was the fact that you had advanced threat actors, advanced persistent threat actors engaged, right? They've discovered that going after the three-letter agencies and after the big corporations was expensive and time consuming. So why not go after the third parties who are not doing, as we talked about, the necessary things? And so, SolarWinds wasn't the target of the advanced threat actor. It was the three-letter agencies and Microsoft source code and everything else that they got with the SolarWinds attack, right? So the way that the state has changed is it's no longer script kiddies, although I'm certainly concerned about those still, but it's more about the folks that have the time and energy, and it's their day job to get in to banks and to the thriller agencies through our vendors, right? So we've built the big moats and scary alligators and all that kind of stuff for our own first party, and now we've discovered that the hired help that we have coming in to get our daily stuff done is actually been the problem, or is now become the problem, right?
Yeah, makes sense. And we talked a little bit about the regulatory kind of impact of this. SolarWinds obviously drove, a lot of that, a lot of the increased accountability, the personal liability. Yeah. Yep. So obviously it's a critical thing. Now, one of the things that I heard at the FAIR conference last year, we had a series of roundtables by vertical, and several of the topics we got into were third-party risk related. And I heard a lot of I don't know, skepticism or even cynicism about, the value in terms of risk reduction. But then and specifically related to third-party risk management. In other words, I think a lot of people felt like it was kind of like a compliance thing, like we're checking boxes. But then we do hear from folks who are genuinely like, we are reducing risk. Our data that we have for our State of Cyber Risk Management report, which comes out tomorrow, shows very much the same thing. But it kind of begs the question of, what does a program look like? And maybe, given a lot of folks, maybe they're kind of early in their maturity with third-party cyber risk management. Maybe we kind of start there and like, what does an established but maybe not super mature program looks like? Vincent, if you don't mind, I'll start with you on this. I mean, how would you describe to somebody, what does a third-party risk management program look like as it gets going and as it's gained at least a little bit of maturity?
Yeah, no, Todd. And first things first. I usually lean into that concept that third-party risk management is about checking a box, because at a deep level, it is. I think as a program matures, though, you then grow the value that the TPRM program is able to provide to the business it supports beyond checking the box. So I'll give you an example. Think about a TPRM program that actually has a decent, if not good, inventory of the engagements that third parties have with that company, understanding the level of access that they have, how that access comes into the first party, the type of data that third party has access to through what mechanism and for what purpose. Think about who the contacts at that third party are. I know this seems very basic, but you'd be very surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, depending on where you work. Maybe you're living this. A lot of outsourcers, a lot of first parties, really don't even have a concept of who their third parties are.
Right.
And if you don't know who your third parties are, there's no way you can possibly work to secure them. And so think about this. Once you have that inventory, you can now start to plug in other risk domains that probably exist, on their own, doing their own thing on an island perhaps, into your overall workflow. I'm sure that, most medium to large size companies have privacy lawyers. They have an AI expert. They have people who are interested in physical security. Bringing all of that to bear in the pursuit of understanding the control environment and the security posture of a third party is, at the end of the day, what third party risk management is about for me. And if you kind of have this idea and you have the people who are focused, you can now start to, as we talked about earlier, look at controls. And to me, that's the hallmark of a capable, advanced TPRM program. They have an inventory, they understand who their third parties are and what they're doing, and they have some sort of semblance of controls testing. It's not just, I'm going to regurgitate a 200 question questionnaire at you, and then you answer all the questions and you give me a SOC 2 and I feel good about it. No, I'm going to distill what you're giving me with regards to assurance into mapping that to controls that I know directly support the security objectives of my company. Because the end result to that are findings or gap analysis. It's through these findings, I feel, that you actively reduce risk, because you are demonstrating that there was an inherent risk, a lack of controls, a weak control, and you are actively reducing that through mitigations, whether that's strengthening controls, employing compensating controls. And that, to me, is really unequivocally a way to demonstrate that third-party risk management is actively reducing risk.
Yeah, that's really good. Like one thing, Vincent, with our report that's coming out tomorrow, we asked about the business outcomes that organizations are receiving from third-party risk management. The number 1 and 2 were better alignment between procurement, security, and legal, and then greater visibility into third-party dependencies and risks, that visibility which you touched on. 4th on the list, so still very high because it's a fairly long list, but 4th was reduced residual risk from high impact third-party relationships. So that, focus on, the controls and reducing the risk that's associated with third parties. So I think that kind of bears out the story that you just told. Greg, you've written about the topic a lot. You focus very much on cyber in your book and your first book and all that. Like, would you add anything? Like, what do you see with these programs that kind of stands out?
Sure. Yeah. Actually, it's funny. I was just so I was glad I was on mute, because when Vincent started this thing about compliance, I was yelping, I think, and then he's correct. You start off with a compliance-driven program to some extent, right, Vincent? I mean, you are checking a box because you're trying to figure out how to just get from point A to point B. I really like the way Vincent laid it out in terms of the maturity level of at least getting an inventory, because if you don't, just take your inventory of your assets in your own enterprise. If you don't have that, you can't affect change within your enterprise. So the same thing is the principle with your third party risk, and then that segues nicely into the compliance discussion, right? Because compliance and cybersecurity are not the same things. They do get conflated, unfortunately, right? Todd and Vincent or most of us on the call are aware of this, right? That those two are not related, but they do in fact get conflated. I think the biggest challenge I see in the space is conflating my compliance work with my cybersecurity work, right? That to your point of getting a bunch of the vendor fatigue with the questionnaires is real. It's been going on for years. It's only getting worse as more people are asking for more questionnaires, and confusing that with a cybersecurity assessment, those are two separate things, right? You're asking for somebody to answer a phone-it-in questionnaire that says, here's where it was at a point in time, perhaps 6 months ago or a year ago. How many of our enterprises stay static for 6 months or even a year? None of them. They all move around quite extensively during that time. In fact, you almost hope they do, because things change, the threats change, and so the questionnaires are becoming a challenge, and they're not cybersecurity. So I think the biggest change that folks can do in terms of maturing their program is look at, and it's why I call the company. It's why I did the secondary title of my first book is third-party threat hunting. We talk about threat hunting for first party all the time, and we look at that. We should be doing the same for third parties. It's not sit back and wait for the phone call to happen. We can be an active player and a participant. And the other thing I'll add is always take a risk-based approach. Do not try and boil the ocean. Don't spread it around like chunky peanut butter. All the euphemisms you could use. You should absolutely be looking first and foremost at your systemically critical vendors. Which are the ones that if they don't operate, you can't operate, or you operate in such a wounded fashion that you can't get business done, right? Focus on those. Ask for walkthroughs. If you tell a vendor, hey, you're really important, you're a critical vendor for me, I guarantee you will get their attention, and they will want to do things with you because everybody likes hearing they're important.
Right. Right. Yeah, Greg, your book, the first one, anyway, I haven't read your second one yet, but the first one, what surprised me is just how much you educate on just good cyber security, cyber risk management generally, right? That you're talking about kind of the core fundamental things that I think anybody doing cyber related risk management needs to understand, third party or not. And you talk about, the impact of threats in that way.
View
Yeah, go ahead.
third party. I'm sorry, I was just going to say, view vendors as an extension of your own enterprise, right? Because
Yeah.
they are essentially, right? If you're a bank, you don't want to make HR software. That's not what you should be doing, right? In fact, your shareholders will be mad at you if you're doing that, right? So you're going to go out to one of the big manufacturers who makes this stuff online as SaaS. They're going to have your employee data in there, prospect data, social security. That's stuff that you should be asking those types of vendors really important questions, right?
Yep, absolutely. Hey, so one of the things when it comes to like how these programs look and whatnot, I always look at it kind of organizationally, like how does third-party risk management or third-party cyber risk management fit in with other, functions? And what comes to mind is just cyber risk management. And Vincent, I don't know how unusual this is, but you own both cyber risk management and third-party risk management, or at least cyber risk management. So you've already kind of blended what we kind of look at as sometimes two related but distinct type of programs. So there's that cyber risk management kind of fit, and then just enterprise risk management or corporate risk management. Let's start with those two, and maybe just start, Vincent, from your perspective. How do you, fit these together? How should folks that are on the phone be thinking, hey, this is the way that these programs should be, working together to drive, better outcomes?
I think it's around truly being integrated into the overall risk framework and risk, kind of methodology of the company. And what I mean by that is that I've seen it in a lot of companies. I've lived through it in past lives. TPRM is on this weird island. And the better integrated a TPRM program is into the overall operation of the business, and especially into how the business manages all types of risk, the more effective it's going to be. Because too often we hold third-party risks out to be this special, different thing. They're not. They're risks, just like any others. And so think about this. You have an enterprise risk management program, and they have a risk register and control libraries. TPRM should mirror that structure and be integrated into the overall structure. I don't mean to say that TPRM should lose its identity and just become another facet of the overall risk management structure, but at the same time, it shouldn't be held out separately. Here's an example. So think about when a business is undergoing a risk and controls self-assessment, a pretty standard ERM practice. And they're looking at, to Greg's point, a critical business process, and they're assessing what are those risks and controls that exist out there that we need to be aware of, that we need to inventory, that we need to monitor, that we need to test. As companies, this is something Greg touched on earlier, as companies do more and more with third parties, I think the term that Greg used was, the help that comes in and does help you with the daily work. That's getting more and more complex as time goes on. I had a manager, pretty senior guy, who said, if it's not core, it's out the door. And what he meant by that is if it doesn't have to do with the exact thing that we focus on in this department, we're outsourcing that because they can do it better than we can and likely for cheaper. And so the third-party relationships that support core business processes have gotten way more than it used to be, which is, as an example, the trucking or the people who fix your fleets. Now it's, third parties are actually doing the data manipulation. They're doing data transformation. They are actually doing the work sometimes. And so why wouldn't you want to be considering the risks at those outsourced service providers right alongside of the first party risks that you would during an RCSA? And to me, that's the number one reason that TPRM has to be integrated into something like the ERM program or the Chief Risk Officer's organization or something like that. Because if not, you're basically reporting out separately and you're not really giving your company a total view of the threat landscape.
Yeah, excellent. Greg, would you add anything to that?
Oh, gosh, no, I think not to sound contrite, but I think Vincent laid it out real well. I don't have anything to add to that. No.
Hey, so Greg, Nick, who's online, he asked, can you talk more about the conflation between compliance and cybersecurity? He finds it difficult to articulate the gray line between the two in his environment, and he's in financial services.
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, so and that's where I spent most of my professional career, along with some other industries. But so compliance is the best way I can explain it, and hopefully it does it for you. And if it's a better way to say it, let me know. Is compliance is a point in time activity, right? So you get a SOC 2 report, you do an ISO certification, whatever it is, that's a compliance activity that shows that you're compliant at a point in time with a certain level of whatever it is that's being evaluated. Cybersecurity is an ongoing activity that never ceases. I know that sounds like job security for me, but it's job security for most people, just because the bad guys are always trying to get in. But cybersecurity is an ongoing activity, not something that's done point in time. And so the challenge with conflating the two is that every company that's been breached was completely compliant the day before. Compliance and cybersecurity are not the same because they don't achieve this. They're not looking to achieve the same goals. Hopefully that explains it.
Yeah.
Does somebody else have a better one?
Well, so Greg, I'll add this because I just had a conversation with one of our board members about this topic. And, the thing is, in some industries, some businesses, the risk controls in place due to compliance are very strong, very high, right? So in some cases, it's like compliance forces you to do things that maybe you wouldn't do just based on risk. But in most organizations, that line, if you will, is lower. And you kind of have to look at compliance is often the minimum, right?
Table stakes.
Exactly. It's table stakes. So I think you have to look at it, for your business. But I think the only way you ever know for sure is doing risk management, right? So, go ahead.
And I was just going to add too, in the financial services industry, in particular, the third-party risk, it was driven largely by compliance effort, right? Was to get get the regulators off your back, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that the challenge I have with, if you follow just the regulators, to your point, Todd, is since when have the regulators ever been on the bleeding edge of technology? And the answer is never. They're always reacting to what happened last week. And so if you're relying your cybersecurity program on compliance efforts, you will be Mr. Last Week, right? You will be too late. You'll be Mr. Too Late, right? As it were, right? So that's the other thing to kind of look at it from a different point of view.
Yeah.
Todd, something just jumps to mind. And, for any of you who have, taken an ISACA certification in the past, and my compliance colleagues hate when I say this, but compliance should be treated like any other risk is the exact verbatim words out of the ISACA kind of body of knowledge. And I think it really demonstrates how compliance is a component of cybersecurity. It is not the capability of cybersecurity. And that really kind of was a mindset shift for me. Like, that's as Greg said, the bare minimum I should be doing. Yeah. I should be programming for much more than that. Yeah. And that's how I explain it to people, Nick. Great question.
Yeah, it is. Michael asks a great question too. He's asking, is there really any efficacy in vendor questions or questionnaires if the third party has solid audit reports. And I'm going to kind of bleed this. It's like a great segue because our next set of topics is about understanding third party controls. So let's just go there. Let's talk about like, how do you, when you're working with third parties, understand their control environment, or at least the controls that you need to understand in a meaningful way. And Vincent, we'll start with you because you kind of talked about this in our intro a little bit, but let's talk about that and address as well Michael's question of like, hey, you've got solid audit reports, a SOC 2, whatever, and it's all fine, right? So if that's the case, what does third party risk management add on top of it, or how do you get the assurance that you need?
Yeah, no, Michael, this is a really good question. And the reason I like this question so much is because I think the answer is sort of not really. It really does depend. And I think too often TPRM practitioners hold their questionnaires too preciously. I think that, Greg mentioned earlier, you kind of just throw the questionnaire at them and call it a day. And to some people, that's job security. In the programs I've run, I have always looked for ways to actively rationalize questionnaires to as minimal a level of effort as possible for all parties concerned. And here's why. You mentioned your question, if they have solid audit reports. Well, if that solid audit report has good overlap to what I actually care about, then the answer is probably not. As an example, so I think we are all aware of HITRUST, and if not, HITRUST started out in the healthcare space as sort of like a SOC 2. It's basically an independent attestation of the security posture of a company as it relates specifically to, at the time, protected health information. Now HITRUST has gotten a lot wider, but I still find a lot of value in it. I do security at a healthcare company. So for me, if you have a report that you are certified, in HITRUST CSF, I'm actually going to take that I will assign a very high level of value to that. And the reason is that our own control requirements are modeled in part around the HITRUST CSF. And so to tie back to my initial, maybe it depends, if the audit reports you're seeing align with your control requirements, then I don't know how much efficacy there is in asking even more questions. One of the things that we're working in our program here at CVS to do is how do we use GRC technology and everyone's favorite buzzword lately, artificial intelligence, to look at all of these assurance documents like audit reports that we receive and distill those into control statements. How do we then match those control statements up against our control requirements and then tailor additional due diligence based on the controls that are the most important to us that we don't see evidence of in what we've already been provided? This is where we're really working to take our questionnaires to, because right now it's a shotgun approach. Bang, 200 questions. Hopefully we hit all the targets that we need to. We're trying to use technology to now reduce the friction of doing business with CVS. We want to see what you got and then tailor our approach from there. So to tie that all out, Michael, if the vendor reports that you're getting, the audit reports that you're getting, have very, very high alignment to your own requirements, probably not. There are a lot of cases in which we accept a HITRUST CSF in lieu of conducting our normal assessment. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, great.
I think I'd add to that would be, Todd, if it's okay, I can add to that.
Go ahead.
Would be in a risk-based approach, your systemically critical vendors, you should be, to get to Michael's point about the questionnaires and audits, is you should be doing physical validation with your most systemically critical vendors, right? That's where you pretend you're from Missouri, the show me state, right? You're going to go and have the vendor physically validate controls are in place. That's your ultimate assurance. That gets you away from compliance, and that gets you into cybersecurity, right? Which is where you really want to be for your most riskiest vendors. You're never going to do, again, we talked about this earlier, you don't want to boil the ocean. You don't want to be spending this time with your low-risk vendors that have 10 records, right? You want to be spending this with your vendors that you've identified as critical and have systemically critical ties to your business operations or your sensitive data or connections to your network, right? Those are vendors that you should be really leaning into with physical validations. The questionnaires are they're a compliance effort, and I think when I ran programs and when I advised my clients on programs, those questionnaires can go to the compliance team because it proves that they're compliant. They got a SOC 2. That's a compliance activity. That's not, in my view, a cybersecurity activity. I'd want more. Like to Vincent's point, I think what you're seeing now is trust centers being public trust centers by companies being put up, and then you can have AI tools process the data for you, which in some cases is better than a questionnaire because it's live data, as it were, right, Todd? And so
Yep.
you get better quality out of that than a questionnaire that was filled out perhaps 6 months or a year ago, right? So in some cases you're seeing that opportunity from AI as a benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. And Greg, I think the key there, what you said about, risk-based approach, doing the initial risk assessment, risk intake or vendor intake, and using that process to drive the degree to which you need to, provide assurance. And, one of the folks that's on our third-party risk working group that we have, Marcus Kaufman, he's talked a lot about we really have to, in some cases, truly partner with the third parties, right? It's not just they fill out forms and you're doing stuff over email, but you're truly partnering on risk. So depending on the degree of dependency or risk or what have you, right? It's about collaborating on reducing risks that have been identified, on understanding those risks, et cetera. So
I'll add to that.
Ahead.
That's a great comment. So vendors are not adversaries, right? Vendors are your partners in your success. They're an extension of your enterprise. If you were a bank and your bank made HR software, you would be polite to your HR software partners. You wouldn't be adversarial. So, and absolutely, you should be partnering with those critical vendors to do tabletop exercises for resiliency efforts and that kind of stuff, right? So, I that's a great comment. I'm glad that the comment's been made in public.
Yeah, fantastic. I guess just any other advice on, understanding third-party controls, like any other things that we haven't talked about that you think people should just understand. Vincent, you mentioned inside out. I don't know how common that is, these days. I know I see it occasionally, but is that an emerging best practice, would you say?
Yeah, so it isn't very common, but to quote the inimitable Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future, you may not know about this, but your kids are going to love it. I think that Drata and Vanta and technology like that are going to become table stakes because just like trust centers and how we're seeing really the evolution of trust there, I think in high criticality relationships, you're going to start seeing larger outsourcers, like perhaps CVS, using their leverage to compel third parties, especially those third parties with less mature control environments, to start running a tool like this. Because what that's basically doing is creating a hyper-tailored real-time or near real-time trust center just for us. Except instead of documents, it's real-time or near real-time status of controls we care about.
Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier at the top of the call, we're seeing this push from CISOs where they now realize their butts are on the line, literally. And so now it's not just how do we build the moat and the walls as high as we can, it's how do we make sure that our chosen allies, their moats are super deep and wide and full of sharks and alligators and other laser bearing creatures, and how high are their walls? I think that as we see more and more of that, you're going to see that inside out approach, because really that's where TPRM, I think, is in its 4.0 iteration. It's real-time controls validation and monitoring.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Hey, so Andrew Shea asks a great question. Again, it's kind of perfect timing because it's going to segue into the next topic. Andrew's on our third-party risk management work group as well. So great to see you online, Andrew. He's asking, what are your thoughts on executing joint risk scenario analysis with your third parties, kind of extending on, Vincent, what you were talking about. And I want to talk about, like, let's bring it back and connect with FAIR. People, on the line, they're almost all, members of the FAIR Institute, probably understand FAIR to one degree or another. And so my question here is, like, how can or does a risk-based approach based on FAIR or using cyber risk quantification, how can that help with TPRM? And also let's talk about how can TPRM help with maybe those programs that aren't necessarily part of it. So kind of look at it bi-directionally. And Vincent, let's start again with you.
Yeah, and I'd actually want to tie in Jorit's question in the Q&A chat as well around, how can you give business value examples in terms of revenue generation or cost reduction. So yeah. I'll just tap on the cost reduction part. So, when we think about FAIR, analysis of information risk, factor analysis of information risk, we're thinking about how do we put dollars to risks, where before, a more qualitative approach, it's like, oh, this is a high risk. Well, with FAIR, I'm able to say with reasonable accuracy, when I do it right, there's $1.5 million, in risk value here. Let's think about cost reduction. All right, let's put our kind of ISACA/GRC nerd hats back on for a second. The cost of the control should never exceed the risk associated with the asset. If you are able to quantify the risks associated with your business assets at a much finer degree, you can be a lot more tailored and intentional in how you apply controls. So think about that. Maybe it turns out that there isn't $1 million worth of risk in a particular area, and you have a significantly expensive control set applied to it. There's an ability there to do less, to make sure that the protection of that asset is commensurate with the risk. And now think about, the other side of Jordan's question around in terms of revenue generation. So again, GRC nerd stuff, risk is really what we are willing to do, to put up with, to accomplish business objectives. If you are able to be very clear-eyed about what a risk truly means in financial terms to the company, it might allow you to look at alternatives that might be even more kind of valuable to the business's ability to achieve their outcomes than you might normally be. Here's an example with AI. Maybe there's a new AI startup that can really, speed your time to market, can do some amazing things in personalized marketing, something like that. I'm not sure, adjust the example to fit your industry, but it's unproven, it's unknown. I posit a strong third-party risk management program can help the business understand if the residual risk in engaging that third party is within the tolerances and thresholds of the company, within their appetite. And so too, can that information help the business make informed decisions that maybe they might not in the past? They might have waved it off and said, that's probably too risky, we don't understand it enough. And then through that risk analysis, you're now enabling the business to do something it might not have, which, and I've actually seen this before, that personalized marketing example was a real example, generates really tangible outcomes on the top line for your business. It really is fairly exciting stuff when a TPRM program can do that. And it's something that everyone should toot their horn when they do it, because it is directly growing the top line from a risk management function, which is actually easier said than done.
Yeah, great points. We talk a lot about in terms of a cyber risk management program of having what we call a risk-informed system, and that system is designed to communicate with business leaders, right? So the line of business owners, those that own revenue, and help them make decisions regarding the risk. Like, they ultimately own the risk. It's not the cybersecurity team or the third-party risk team and so forth. But I think what's incumbent there is, because back to that risk-informed system, is you have to be able to express that risk and do so, in terms that these people understand. Usually that means dollars and cents. So I'll go to Greg for a moment just on this. Like, how do you see the sort of the intersection of cyber risk management with FAIR and third-party risk management and the goals around really managing the risk of vendors and so forth?
Yes. So I think, first of all, I've been a big proponent of doing quantitative analysis for years, right? So back in the day, I read how to measure anything in cybersecurity, or how to measure anything in cybersecurity risk, right? So, and actually took a FAIR course. So I've been a big proponent of this in this space for a while. And the reason why in cyberspace is because, and it's true in TPRM, is in any risk management system that does it in the qualitative thing, high risk, medium, and low. Let's just take the simplest ones that most people have. Let's take a typical TPRM program. You have 1,000 vendors. If you're lucky, you only have 1,000. And let's say they're evenly distributed. You got it. Let's make math easy for everybody. 333 highs and mediums and lows, give or take, right? We know there's a rounding error there. Let's say you're just going to focus on your high risk vendors. You still have 333 vendors to manage. That's a lot. That's a lot for any large or any small organization or large organization is going to struggle with that number. Never mind that you're not even paying attention to some extent to the mediums and lows. So how do you further differentiate that? And again, this is where I think why most of us on this call and are members of FAIR and in this space toot this horn, is because if everything's high, at least 333 things are high, then everything's a priority, and you have no way to understand what really is the most critical. And whenever I do trainings for this stuff, and I talk to clients, it's you must take a risk-based approach. First of all, let's talk back to regulator issues. Regulators don't expect you to boil the ocean either. So if you're worried about getting the regulators breathing down your neck and getting all mad at you, they expect you to take a risk-based approach because it's sane. It's what humans need to do anyways, right? So if you're taking a risk-based approach, you're going to have to be able to take into account how the cybersecurity risk is measured. Now, when you're doing TPRM, a third-party risk, there's some the math gets a little different, right? So that because you don't have direct control over that third party, but nevertheless, if you're able to measure that quantitatively. Let's take the finance folks, right? There's a lot of folks in finance who are doing third-party risk. I know when I switched over to doing third-party risk in a quantitative approach, that resonated much more succinctly with executives, right? If I could tell them there's a $5 million risk of a breach in the next 3 years, that resonated better than it's high risk, because on their screen, everything's high risk. I mean, I might bring in anything to executives that are low risk to begin with, right? So numbers matter. And especially in today's world, forget even if you're in finance, numbers matter, right? If everything is painted over like kind of chunky peanut butter again, like everything's high risk, medium or low, you're not able to differentiate what's truly important, right? And make better risk-based decisions. I just think quantitative approach and FAIR give you a better surgical knife to cut through the noise of everything else that's going on.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I look at it kind of like you've got third-party risk management, which is, sort of the object of focus is related to the third parties. In the FAIR cyber risk management world, it's scenarios, and they both involve one another, right? But I would say that the data that you get through third-party risk efforts, when you're assessing vendors, you're collecting a lot of data, you're understanding the, business capabilities or processes that they're supporting and all this. It's incredible information. Even if your programs are separate, having that information, having that bridge between third-party risk management and the fair-based cyber risk management program, or even non-fair-based program, that's, I think, just essential. And that's what folks like on the line should be building, if they haven't already built that, is that bridge between the two, the data, the goals, et cetera, all very, synergistic, not to use a buzzword. So let me ask, I guess, kind of like, let's switch to just really quickly. Well, actually, let me look. We have a couple of questions. Or nope, that's just Jorrit responding to Vincent. Let's move on to really quickly the future of third-party risk management. And I think we touched on this a little bit. Like, there's things that you're seeing today, AI, et cetera, outside or inside out scans and things like that are probably kind of the part of that future. But let's talk about where you guys see it going. And Greg, I'll start with you on this one. Like, where do you see third-party risk management going, especially for cyber, like at least in the near term?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to play off kind of what's been talked about already a little bit, unfortunately, but I can expand a little bit more. So you're going to get the opportunities of AI, right? So we've talked a bit about the challenges and how you maybe not talked about some of the challenges and doing model risk analysis and stuff, but on the opportunity side for AI is getting away from humans having to process a lot of the data that we get from third parties and leveraging well-trained AI agents to do that for us, so that we can do, I really hate the term less, well, more with less, but we can do a little bit more with a little bit less, right? So that because again, AI, but if all you're doing is reading SOC 2 reports for your day-to-day job, you probably want to start to do something different, because those AI agents are coming along and they are going to start to process a lot of that data that we do. And I think that's an opportunity for us to actually use our brain pans in much more productive ways, right? And I love the fact that I think we're getting slowly away from questionnaires, right? That we're going to go more and more towards sort of this almost a direct connection with our vendors, in terms of what they're doing with their cybersecurity, right? So one, I'm not a big fan of questionnaires just because they are compliance-driven activity. I do understand the need for them currently, but I think eventually you're going to see that this is going to, especially for vendors that are of critical importance to organizations, you won't be doing questionnaires anymore. And the sell is, hey, if you're going to give me more information more directly in real time, I'm not going to send you a questionnaire.
Yeah.
Now I can see a lot of vendors going, I might be up for that, So again, I think those are the two big opportunities we're seeing.
Yeah. It does make you think, like, if your vendors are doing, your third parties are doing their own, quote, first party cyber risk management, why can't they just be providing that information and be more of an information exchange in a secure way, et cetera, right? It's sensitive info, but yeah, I got to see that kind of thing is probably coming. Vincent, where do you see things headed?
Greg kind of ate all the meat on that bone already. Really, the things that Greg notes are where I see TPRM going. But I would add that, I touched on it earlier, but controls, validation, and verification and monitoring. This is something that TPRM programs are doing at the very most mature end. They've really translated that questionnaire into discrete control tests. I think you're going to see the default for a TPRM program in the next, probably 2 to 4 years be about controls testing and not about death by questionnaires.
Yeah.
And I think that as AI solutions become integrated into all of the tools that we use today already, which it's if you head out to FairCon or the TPRA conference, you're going to see it. Every single platform for third-party risk management that exists is doing something with AI. And if they're not, they're going to go out of business. And the reason that I highlight this is because the integration of large language models into core TPRM practices is going to be so augmentative that there won't be an excuse not to execute in this way. And what I mean by that is what I laid out earlier about what we're trying to do at CVS right now. How do we take information that already exists, whether that be private information shared by a third party or public information on the surface, deep, or dark webs, How do we make sense of that in a powerful and consistent way that doesn't require too much human brain power? And then how do we then tailor our outreach based on what we already know? In an age where I think that we're, as TPRM practitioners, being pushed not just to do more with less, as we've already covered, but to do it better and faster, there really is no other way to be successful. As the number of third parties grows and grows and grows, we have to strike that grand bargain as TPRM practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be comfortable with doing less in general. I don't even mean doing more with less. I mean literally. How do we find ways to drop these assessment cycle times, which, I talk to some people, it's 45, 60, 90 days. You want to talk, Jort, about how do you materialize business value in terms of revenue generation? Think about compressing the TPRM cycle in such a way that it accelerates time to market.
Great point.
So, that's kind of where I see the future going. We're going to be going faster and farther on a lot more third parties.
Yeah.
So we have to get there somehow.
Yeah, that's great, Vincent. Yeah, fantastic. Hey, so we're going to wrap up, but Vincent, Greg, just fantastic job. Thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate what you've done here. Got to thank Julie at Third Party Risk Association for connecting all of us. I will say, for those of you that are not familiar with or not members of Third Party Risk Association, go learn more about it. Vincent is on their board. Greg has developed and teaches their third-party cyber risk management course. So there's just a lot of goodness with what they do. They lean heavily into cyber, although they cover third-party risk more generally. So, but definitely leverage that as a resource. I will just wrap up with one promotion, and that's of FairCon. So right now, we still have the super early bird rate open. We haven't yet announced our agenda. So once we announce our agenda, we'll move on to just the early bird rate. But it's available now. This conference, if you haven't been part of it before, it's just phenomenal. So last year we held it in DC. This year we'll be in New York City at this amazing venue called the Glass House. And so 2 days of just a ton of amazing, thought-provoking topics. The theme, we were kind of laughing about this, or everything's AI. It's the theme is resetting cyber risk in the age of AI, and it's not going to be all about AI. Obviously, there will be, but it's just recognizing that times have changed and things are moving faster. There's a lot more uncertainty. There's a lot more risk than ever before from a cyber perspective. So we're just leaning into that. And so it's going to be probably different than it ever has been before in terms of topics and speakers and so forth. So take a look at our website for that. You can go to justfairconference.org if you're not familiar with it. Register now to get that super early bird rate. You can see on our website the speakers from last year. So just to give you an idea of the power of what we do there, take a look at that. You can see the speakers. You can see all the different topics that we had. It was absolutely just amazing. So check that out. And with that, we'll wrap it up today. Again, thanks guys for being part of this. If we get other questions or whatnot, we'll reach out to y'all. We'll get answers for people. Happy to answer offline where we can. And otherwise, just have a fantastic rest of your day and rest of the week. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.